There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when something has gone very wrong and nobody yet knows how wrong. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of an empty church or a sleeping child. It is the silence of held breath, of eyes that flick sideways without moving heads, of a bartender who stops wiping the glass and just holds it, cloth pressed flat against the rim, waiting. That silence fell inside the Anchor's Rest pub on a Thursday night in November, right after a large man in a faded Marine Corps hoodie put his hand on a woman's shoulder and shoved. Not a stumble, a shove. The deliberate, territorial kind. The kind that says, "Move, you're in my way, you don't matter, step aside." She stumbled forward. Her drink tilted. A few drops of amber liquid hit the sticky floor. She caught herself on the bar edge, straightened, turned around slowly. And that was when the silence happened. Because the man in the faded hoodie, loud, red-faced, 3 sheets past drunk, had no idea. He genuinely, completely, with the full confidence of someone who had never once needed to check, had no idea who he had just put his hands on. He didn't know about the briefings she'd sat in at the Pentagon. He didn't know about the admirals who stood when she walked into a room. He didn't know about the letter with the presidential seal on her desk, the one authorizing her current command, the one that had her name on it in black ink. Rear Admiral Margaret "Mags" Calloway, followed by a list of responsibilities that covered thousands of sailors, dozens of ships, and enough classified information to make a man's hair go white. He just saw a small woman in civilian clothes standing near his usual bar stool, so he shoved her, and she turned around. What happened next would take less than 4 minutes. It would be witnessed by 11 people, it would get talked about for years, and it would cost the man in the hoodie something he had never once considered losing. This is that story. But to understand what happened in those 4 minutes, you have to understand the 23 years that came before them. You have to understand a girl from a small Ohio town who was told, in very clear terms, by very confident people, that she did not belong anywhere near the United States Navy. You have to understand what it takes to prove that kind of person wrong. Not once, not with a single dramatic moment, but every single day, in every single room, for 2 solid decades. You have to understand Mags Calloway. Because what the drunk Marine saw was a small woman in a bar. What he had actually touched was a person made almost entirely of controlled fire. And that night, for the first time in a very long while, she let a little of it show. Margaret Calloway was 11 years old the first time someone told her that the military was not for girls like her. It was her Uncle Dennis who said it. He was sitting at the kitchen table of her parents' house in Morrow County, Ohio, on a Sunday afternoon in late August, with a plate of her mother's pot roast in front of him and a glass of sweet tea sweating rings onto the good tablecloth. He was not a cruel man. He had no idea he was doing any damage. He was simply stating what seemed to him to be a plain and obvious fact, the way you state that the sky is blue or that snow is cold. And he said it with the mild amusement of an adult who finds a child's dream mildly charming but slightly misinformed. Margaret had just told the table that she wanted to command a Navy ship. Ships, her Uncle Dennis said, chuckling and cutting into his roast, are for boys, Mags. Big ones especially. The Navy's no place for a little thing like you. Her father said nothing. Her mother changed the subject to the weather, and Margaret sat very still in her chair and ate her green beans one at a time and said nothing at all, which was something she would get very good at over the years. The particular skill of going utterly quiet on the outside, while something inside her was getting louder and louder and louder. She came from a town of about 4,000 people set in the flat, wide middle of Ohio, where the winters were grey and long and the summers smelled like cut grass and diesel, where most people stayed and most people were fine with staying, and where the general shape of a life was understood by most everyone before the life had even fully started. You went to school. You found work. You built something modest and solid and local. You stayed. Margaret loved her town. She loved her parents. She loved the way the fields went golden in September, and the way the high school football games brought half the county to the same bleachers on Friday nights. She loved the particular comfort of being known, of being part of a place that had its own texture and its own rhythms and its own way of seeing the world. She just always felt, from the time she was very small, that she was also meant for somewhere else, something larger, something that would require her to be more than what a town of 4,000 could see. Her father was a county roads engineer, her mother taught 3rd grade. Neither of them had military backgrounds. The closest the Calloway family got to the armed forces was a framed photograph on the hallway wall of her maternal grandfather in his army uniform from the Second World War, a young man squinting into some European sun, looking both terrified and proud in the way that young men in old photographs so often do. Margaret used to stop in front of that photograph sometimes when she was walking to the bathroom at night and study it, not with sentimentality, with something more like calculation, trying to read in his face what it took, what kind of person you had to be. She was a serious child. Her teachers said so in the kind of careful, diplomatic language that teachers use when they mean something that could be taken two ways. She takes things very seriously. She is very focused. She has a strong sense of purpose for her age. What they meant, mostly, was that she was not easy. She was not the kind of child who went along with things because going along was simpler. She asked why about everything. She pushed back on answers that didn't satisfy her. She had a quality that made certain adults slightly uncomfortable, a quality that would be called assertiveness in a boy and something else entirely in a girl, and she had it from a very young age, before she had the vocabulary for it or the political framework to understand what was being done to her when people tried to sand it down. In 4th grade, she got into an argument with a substitute teacher about whether women had ever commanded military vessels. The substitute said no. Margaret said she didn't think that was right. The substitute said Margaret was being disruptive. Margaret went home and got into her father's encyclopedia set and found everything she could and brought it back the next day and put it on the teacher's desk and said nothing, just left it there, and went to her seat. Her mother was called in. It was explained that Margaret needed to learn to express disagreement in a more appropriate way. Margaret listened to this very politely and internalized none of it. By the time she was 14, she had read everything the Morrow County Public Library had on naval history. By 15, she had started writing letters, actual paper letters, formal and careful, to the United States Naval Academy requesting information about admission requirements. By 16, she had a training schedule posted on her bedroom wall and was running 4 miles every morning before school in whatever weather Ohio threw at her, which in winter meant running through gray pre-dawn cold with ice on the sidewalks and her breath coming out in white clouds and nobody watching except occasionally a neighbor's dog that barked at her from behind a chain-link fence every single morning without fail, as though it had just that moment noticed her. She liked those runs. She liked the part where the rest of the world was still asleep and it was just her and the dark and the cold and the choice to keep moving. She would come to understand later that this was exactly the kind of experience the Naval Academy was trying to cultivate. The ability to function, to push, to continue, when there was no one watching and no external reward and nothing but the discipline you'd built inside yourself. She was training for that without quite knowing it. Or maybe she knew it perfectly well. With Margaret Calloway, it was sometimes hard to say where instinct ended and strategy began. She got into the Naval Academy at 18, full appointment. She found out on a Tuesday afternoon in April when she was standing in the kitchen eating an apple, and her mother handed her the envelope with an expression of such careful, loaded neutrality that Margaret knew before she opened it. She read the letter once, set it on the counter, finished the apple. Then went to her room and cried for about 20 minutes, not from sadness, but from the particular and overwhelming relief of having a thing you'd built your entire life around for 7 years actually materialize. The physical reality of it, after so long, was almost too much weight. Then she washed her face, went back downstairs, and started making a list of everything she needed before she reported in July. Annapolis was nothing like Ohio. This seems obvious to say, but the specifics of the difference mattered. Ohio had shaped her in certain ways. The practicality, the directness, the slight suspicion of anything that seemed more interested in appearance than function. Annapolis ran on ritual and hierarchy and tradition going back centuries. And the visual language of the place was intense and deliberate in a way that took adjustment. The buildings were beautiful. The Chesapeake sat at the edge of everything like a promise or a warning depending on the day. The uniform felt, the first time she put it on, like stepping into the physical form of a commitment she'd been making internally for years. She was also, and she registered this quickly and without drama, one of the very few women in her class who had grown up nowhere near a military family, nowhere near a coastline, and nowhere near any institution that had prepared her specifically for this particular world. Most of her classmates were the sons and daughters of officers. They had the vocabulary, they had the context. They had been to base housing and officers' clubs and had grown up understanding the invisible architecture of military rank and protocol, the way Margaret had grown up understanding which road to take to avoid the bad train crossing and how to read the sky for a weather change coming in off the flat land. She was not behind. She had worked too hard to be behind. But she was translating in real time, and that took energy that some of her classmates were spending elsewhere. She did not complain about this. She did not mention it to anyone. She catalogued the gap, calculated what it would take to close it, and closed it. The other thing she catalogued, also without comment, was the way certain spaces received her. or did not. There is a particular experience that women who enter institutions built by and historically for men carry with them from the first day. It is not always overt. Sometimes it is overt. There were men in her class who made comments, who did small, constant things designed to signal that her presence was provisional, that she was being tolerated rather than welcomed, that she would need to prove something that her male counterparts were never asked to prove. Most of the time it was subtler than that, a certain quality of attention that was slightly too evaluative and slightly too surprised when she was good. A particular form of praise that always had a comma after it, she's very capable, for. A sentence that always trailed into an implicit comparison. The casual assumption, in group settings, that she was there in some supporting capacity until she proved otherwise, often in the same meeting, sometimes more than once with the same person. She learned to work with this the way a carpenter learns to work with a warped board. You don't pretend it's straight. You account for it. You build around it. You use it if you can. What she did not do was let it make her smaller. This was the option that was always being quietly extended to her, always available, always slightly disguised as something more reasonable. Just don't make a fuss, just work harder, just prove yourself and eventually it will be fine. And what this option actually required was that she accept the premise that she had something to apologize for, that her presence required justification, that she was the variable in the equation rather than the institution. She declined this option, not loudly, not with speeches or confrontations, just in the daily practice of carrying herself exactly as she intended to carry herself, taking up exactly the space she had earned, speaking with exactly the authority she had built, and not reducing any of it by a single degree to make anyone around her more comfortable. This made some people very uncomfortable. She graduated in the top 12% of her class. The years that followed were a particular kind of building, the kind where each floor is harder to construct than the last because you're working at greater height, with more wind and more scrutiny, and fewer people who've been where you're going to tell you which materials hold. She did her surface warfare officer training. She was assigned to the USS Shiloh. She did her work. She was very good at her work in the specific way that people are good at things they have wanted for so long and prepared for so thoroughly that the doing of it feels like coming home, even when the home is made of steel in motion and the constant low thrum of an engine under your feet. She was promoted to lieutenant at 25, lieutenant commander at 31, commander at 36. Each promotion came with its own set of rooms she hadn't been in before, its own vocabulary, its own version of the evaluative attention she'd been navigating since Annapolis. At each level there were new people who had to recalibrate their initial read of her. At each level there were a few people who never recalibrated and just became steadily more rigid as she continued to advance past where they'd internally capped her. She noted all of this. She let none of it divert her. At 39, she was given command of her first ship, the USS Leyte Gulf, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. She stood on the bridge for the first time as commanding officer on a grey April morning, with the wind coming off the water, cold and direct, and she thought distantly of a Sunday afternoon in a kitchen in Ohio, and a man with a plate of pot roast who had no bad intentions and no idea what he was calibrating her against. She thought, here then. The Leyte Gulf was her ship for 3 years. What happened in those 3 years? The operations, the deployments, the decisions made in bad weather and worse intelligence, the moments of genuine crisis that required the kind of judgment that can't be trained into a person, can only be developed through the particular education of being responsible for other people's lives. This is not the kind of story that gets told easily in linear form because the most important things that happened were not dramatic. They were cumulative. They were the 10,000 small correct choices and the 3 large correct choices, and the one terrible night in a shipping lane near the Korean Peninsula when something went badly sideways and she made a decision in 45 seconds that she would spend the next decade occasionally waking up at 3 in the morning to revisit, not with regret, but with the permanent vigilance of someone who understands exactly how thin the margin was. That night, and the 45 seconds at the center of it, was known within certain naval circles. It was not public. It was not a headline. It was the kind of thing that gets passed between people who understand what it means, quietly, in the language of those who have had to make those kinds of calls. She was promoted to Rear Admiral at 44. The letter arrived on her desk in her office at Naval Station Norfolk, and she sat with it for a while without opening it, the way she'd sat with the Academy acceptance letter on the kitchen counter of her parents' house 33 years earlier, except now she didn't need to finish eating anything first. She just sat with the weight of what she'd built, let it be real for a minute. Then she opened it, read it, set it down, made a phone call to her mother in Ohio who was 82 and still sharp, and who said, when she heard, "Well, I should think so," which was the most Ohio sentence in the world and the most perfectly her mother sentence in the world, and Margaret laughed, the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere low and genuine. That night, a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the letter, she went to the Anchor's Rest. She went because a friend had texted her asking if she wanted to get out of the base bubble for a night and have one drink like a normal person, and Margaret had said yes because she was, despite everything, a person who could sometimes want a thing as simple as a dim pub and a bourbon and an hour of not being Rear Admiral Calloway. She was wearing dark jeans and a grey sweater, and her hair was down, which it almost never was, and she looked, to someone who had no reason to look more carefully, like any other 44-year-old woman getting a drink at a bar on a Thursday. The Anchor's Rest was the kind of place that had been exactly the same for 20 years and intended to stay that way. Dark wood, low lighting, a jukebox that leaned heavily toward classic rock, a collection of regulars who occupied the same stools with the comfortable permanence of furniture. There was nothing remarkable about it except that it was genuine, which in her experience was rarer than it should be. She got to the bar, ordered a bolete neat. Her friend was running late, texting apologies. She didn't mind. She was content to stand there with her drink and be nobody for a little while. She was on her second sip when she heard him, loud the way drunk people are loud when they've lost track of their own volume, talking to another man at a table about something that Margaret clocked peripherally as the particular aggressive nostalgia of men who peaked in the military and hadn't fully adjusted to civilian life since. Not unusual. Not her business. She had known men like this. She understood the shape of their unhappiness. She shifted slightly at the bar to make room for a woman squeezing past. This put her, without her registering it, in the path of the man in the faded Marine Corps hoodie, who was coming back from the bathroom on a route that took him directly to his stool, a route he had been taking all night, a route he considered his by established right. He came up behind her. She was turned slightly away, looking toward the door for her friend, and he put his hand between her shoulder blades and shoved, the full weight of it. Not a tap, not an excuse me. A shove, the message clear. You are in my way, and I don't have time for you to figure that out on your own. She stumbled, caught the bar edge. Her bourbon tilted. 3 drops hit the floor. She straightened. She turned around. The room did not actually go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces, starting with the bartender, then the couple 2 stools down, then the table nearest the bar, moving outward like a ripple from a stone dropped in still water, until the entire immediate area of the pub was doing the thing where people appeared to be looking at something else while looking directly at this. The man in the hoodie hadn't stopped moving. He was already pulling himself onto his stool with the confident obliviousness of someone who doesn't expect consequences for small acts of rudeness. Margaret looked at him. She didn't say anything yet. She just looked at him with the steady, measuring attention of a person who has spent 23 years in rooms where looking correctly is half of leadership, and who has never once in any of those rooms needed to perform authority because she carried it in her posture, her stillness, the particular quality of her attention. It took him about 4 seconds to feel it. He turned, and for the first time that night, the drunk man in the Marine Corps hoodie looked at the woman he'd shoved. He didn't know her. He had no idea. He saw a small woman in a grey sweater with a bourbon in her hand and a look on her face that he could not immediately categorize, and something in his nervous system, some animal part of him that still worked correctly, even through the bourbon, registered that he had made an error. He just didn't know yet what kind. "That your spot?" Margaret said. Her voice was conversational, perfectly level, the way you ask someone what time it is. "What?" he said. "The bar," she said. "That your designated spot?" He blinked. "Lady, I just needed to get through." "You put your hands on me," she said. Still conversational. "To get through." "I didn't. It was just, you were in the way." She looked at him for another moment. The bar was very quiet. "Here's what I'm going to do," she said. She picked up her bourbon. "I'm going to stand right here and finish this drink. And you're going to sit on that stool, and you're going to think quietly about whether the way you just handled that is how you want to be handling things. Are you serious right now?" His voice got louder, the instinct of a man accustomed to volume working in his favor. "I'm always serious," she said. "It's a character flaw." The bartender made a sound that might have been a cough and was definitely a laugh. And it was in that moment, the quiet certainty of her, the immovability, the complete absence of fear, that the man on the bar stool understood something had gone wrong for him in a way he hadn't mapped yet. He just didn't know how wrong. That was still coming. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he had been a Marine for 8 years. which was a fact he carried like most people carry a wallet. Always on him, always ready to produce when the situation called for it, or when the situation didn't call for it but he felt it should. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had come back from the second one different in the way that some people come back different, not broken in the visible dramatic way that gets made into movies, but altered in a more subtle and permanent sense, the way a door can be slightly off its frame after a house settles. Still functional, still opening and closing, just never quite as smooth as before. He'd been out for 6 years. He worked now as a site supervisor for a construction company in Virginia Beach, which was reasonable work and paid well enough, and which he was genuinely good at in the practical mechanical sense of understanding how structures go together and what order things need to happen in, and how to manage men who sometimes needed pushing and sometimes needed leaving alone. He was not a bad man. This is important to say plainly, because what happened that night was not the story of a bad man. It was the story of a man who had spent years operating in a culture, first the Marines, then construction sites, where certain behaviors were so normalized that they had become invisible to him. Where taking up space was authority, where physical directness was efficiency, where a woman standing near a bar stool you considered yours was, categorically, an inconvenience rather than a person with equal claim to the floor. He wasn't even aware of the calculation. That was the thing. There was no malice in the shove, no real intention to harm or humiliate. It was just the automatic motion of a man who had never been required to consider whether certain motions were options. This is also important to say plainly, because understanding it is what makes what happened next meaningful. If Dale Pruitt had been a cartoon villain, a pure bully in a Marine hoodie looking for a target, the story would be simpler and less interesting, and would not have mattered to nearly as many people. He was just a man who had never once been stopped. Until now. His friend at the table, a former Army MP named Gary, who was significantly less drunk and significantly more attuned to social weather, had watched the whole thing unfold from about 15 feet away. Gary had seen Margaret catch herself on the bar, had seen her turn around, had seen the particular quality of her stillness, which struck him immediately as the kind of stillness that belongs to people who command rooms for a living. He had spent years working around officers. He knew their quality. He'd clocked it on her the moment she turned. He was now making the small, urgent eye contact of a man trying to silently signal his friend that something is very wrong here. Please stop talking right now. Dale was not receiving the signal. Dale was instead doing the thing where his volume had gotten louder, without his quite deciding to make it louder, the instinctive escalation of a man whose authority is being questioned in public and who has no framework for this particular kind of questioning. He was used to authority challenges that came in forms he could read and respond to. Physical ones, or hierarchical ones within systems he understood. What he was not used to was a small woman in a grey sweater who was not raising her voice, not moving from her spot, not displaying any of the behavioral signals that he understood as confrontation, and yet who was somehow more threatening in her complete stillness than anyone who had ever come at him loudly. "I think you need to take a breath," he said to her, which was a spectacular miscalculation, and the people nearby knew it immediately. Margaret looked at him with an expression that a person who knew her well would have recognized as the face she made when she was genuinely considering whether a response was worth the energy. A face she made sometimes in briefings when someone said something that was so comprehensively wrong that the most merciful thing might be to just let it sit there and decompose on its own. She decided apparently that a response was worth the energy. "Okay," she said, "since we're doing this. You were in the Marine Corps?" He blinked. The hoodie had told her. "Yeah. What rank when you got out?" Something shifted in him. Not defensiveness yet, but the beginning of it, the slight tightening that comes when a question feels like it might be leading somewhere. "Staff Sergeant." She nodded, took a sip of her bourbon. "Good rank," she said, in the tone of a person who knows exactly what good means in that context, which is not a general compliment but a specific evaluation. 8 years? Yeah. The word was shorter now. "And since then?" "Construction. Site supervisor." He said it with the particular defensiveness of a man who senses he is being compared unfavorably to something but isn't sure yet what. 6 years. "Good work," she said. Same tone, same evaluation. She was quiet for a moment. "The Marine Corps taught you to handle yourself," she said, "which I respect. It's a hard institution. It makes real demands." She turned her glass on the bar top, a small, slow rotation. "It also has a culture, like every institution, that carries some things that don't transfer well to the rest of life. Things that worked inside the structure and don't work outside it. I'm sure you've noticed some of that yourself." He had. He would never have said so in this company on this night, but he had. He had a therapist, had seen her twice, and then stopped going because the twice was already more than any of his friends knew about. He had noticed specifically that certain things that were completely normal on deployment, the compression of your own emotional life to almost nothing, the reduction of everyone around you to functional categories, the management of uncertainty through control, those things were not working so well at home or at bars or in relationships. He had noticed this. He had not done very much with the noticing. He said, "I don't need a lecture from some woman in a bar." Gary, at the table, closed his eyes. The bartender put down the glass he was holding. Margaret looked at Dale Pruitt with an expression that was not anger. It was something more complicated and more final than anger. It was the look of a person closing a door they had been briefly considering leaving open. "Fair enough," she said. She put her hand in the back pocket of her jeans, which made Dale tense briefly, a combat reflex, before she produced a small card that she set on the bar and slid toward him. Not aggressively, just placed it there. "When you decide you want to know," she said, "that'll tell you." She picked up her bourbon, turned back to the bar. He picked up the card. It took him a moment to process what he was reading because his brain was working through a haze of alcohol and the dissonance between what he was reading and what he was currently experiencing. A woman in a grey sweater who had just turned her back to him at a bar were not reconciling immediately. Then they reconciled. The card read, "Rear Admiral Margaret Calloway, United States Navy." Below that, her current command. Below that, a direct office line. He stared at it. The man next to him on the bar, a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer named Frank, who had been observing this entire exchange with the quiet professional appreciation of a craftsman watching someone else work, leaned over slightly and said, very quietly, "Son, that woman commands more sailors than were in your entire base." Dale Pruitt sat with that for a moment. The pub was still doing its quiet thing, that held breath quality. Someone at the back had put a Tom Petty song on the jukebox and it was playing at normal volume, but it felt distant, like music from another room. Dale looked at the card, looked at Margaret's back, looked at the card again. He was not, it turned out, entirely without the capacity to receive information that was difficult. Some part of what his 8 years in the Marine Corps had built. The part that was actually functional and transferable. The part about accountability, about the standard, about what you owe to someone you've wronged. That part was still working. It worked slowly through the bourbon, but it worked. He got off his stool. He was not graceful about it. His legs were less cooperative than he would have liked. But he got off the stool and he stood next to Margaret at the bar and he said, without looking at her, he couldn't quite manage looking at her. "That was wrong of me. What I did, I shouldn't have touched you." She didn't turn around immediately. She finished the sip she was taking. Then she turned, looked at him. Same steady look, but something different in it now. Not softer exactly, but less closed. The door that had been shutting was paused. "Thank you," she said, "just that." "I didn't know. It wouldn't have been okay if I was anyone else," she said. "That's the thing to sit with." He nodded. He was sober enough for that to land. He would be sober enough by the time he got home that night and sat in his kitchen with water and the beginning of a headache to feel the full weight of it landing. But even now, standing in a bar he'd been coming to for 3 years, he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been shown something true about himself that he hadn't been able to see before, and who is not sure yet what to do with it. He went back to his stool. Gary said nothing to him. Gary was a wise man. Margaret turned back to the bar, finished her bourbon. When the bartender, whose name was Terence and who had worked at the Anchor's Rest for 11 years and who would tell this story for the rest of his life, asked if she wanted another, she said yes, and also one for the man at the table who wasn't drinking, gesturing at Gary, who had clearly been the sensible one. And Terence said that was very kind and meant it. Her friend arrived at 9:20, slightly out of breath, apologizing for the traffic. Margaret said don't worry about it, said the place was nice, said she'd already had an interesting evening and they should get a table. She didn't explain further. She never explained much, when it could be avoided. But the evening, the 4 minutes at the bar, the card on the wood, the conversation that went 3 rounds before it resolved, was not finished having effects. It was just moving into its next phase, which was the phase that neither Margaret, nor Dale, nor Gary, nor Terence fully expected. The retired Navy Chief Frank, the quiet man on the bar stool, had a daughter who worked in digital media. He called her the next morning, a Friday, early, before she was properly awake, and told her what he'd seen. He told it straight, the way Navy chiefs tell things, without embellishment, just the facts in sequence, because the facts were enough. His daughter asked if he minded if she wrote something short about it. Frank said he supposed not, as long as she was accurate. She was accurate. She posted it Friday afternoon. A short piece, maybe 4 paragraphs, no names except the rank, No identifying details about the pub, just the sequence of events as her father had described them. She had about 2,000 followers at the time, mostly in the military and veterans communities. By Saturday morning it had been shared 1,200 times. By Sunday evening the share count was in 6 figures and climbing, and people who had never met Margaret Calloway, or been inside the Anchor's Rest, or thought particularly hard about what it means to put your hands on a stranger at a bar, were reading about what happened there and feeling, in varying intensities and from very different directions, the particular resonance of a story that had touched something true. Some of them responded to what they understood as a story about rank and military respect, the correct order of things being asserted and maintained. Some responded to what they understood as a story about women in positions of authority and the daily experience of being underestimated. Some responded to what seemed to them a story about grace, the choice to not destroy a man with what you had available to destroy him, the deliberate restraint of someone with real power who chose to give a person a door rather than a wall. Some of the veterans in the comments section talked about Dale, not mockingly, with recognition. With the specific recognition of people who knew that culture, who had come out of it themselves and had their own versions of that moment, of seeing clearly what had transferred from the military and what hadn't, what the uniform had protected them from having to examine, and what civilian life had eventually stopped protecting them from. A few people wrote directly to the post to say they'd been Dale, past tense, and to say what had made the tense change. Margaret did not see any of this until Monday morning, when her aide knocked on her office door at Naval Station Norfolk and stood in the doorway with an expression that combined professional neutrality and barely contained amusement and said, "Ma'am, there's something you should probably be aware of." She read the post. She read enough of the comments to understand the scale. Then she looked up at her aide, who was still standing in the doorway. "Frank," she said. "Did he say who his daughter was? I can find out, ma'am. See if you can. I'd like to send him something." Her aide made a note. "And the coverage? There are 3 news organizations requesting comment." Margaret looked out the window at the grey November sky over the base, at the ships in the distance. She thought about the 45 seconds on the bridge of the Leyte Gulf. She thought about a Sunday kitchen in Ohio. She thought about all the rooms where she had been very quiet on the outside, while something got louder and louder inside. "No comment," she said. "The story is what it is. It doesn't need me to explain it." Her aide nodded. Made another note. Was almost out the door when Margaret said, "One more thing. Mom? Find out if there are any veteran transition support programs in the Virginia Beach area. The kind that work specifically on civilian adjustment, culture transfer, that kind of thing." Her aide looked at her for a moment. "Yes, Mom." "Good," Margaret said, and turned back to her window. The story kept moving. It moved through the week and into the next, carried by the particular energy of something that had hit several different veins at once. The gender vein, the military vein, the power vein, the accountability vein, and those veins ran through enough different communities that the piece kept finding new audiences who each read it through their own lens and found it said something they needed said. A documentary filmmaker reached out. A podcast. 2 separate op-ed requests from publications that covered military affairs. 3 invitations to speak, one from a women's leadership organization, one from a veterans group in Virginia, one from a business school that had apparently decided this was a case study in crisis management or leadership presence or something academic that Margaret found slightly baffling. She declined all of it, politely, through her aide, with thanks. She had not gone to the Anchor's Rest to make a point. She had gone to have a bourbon and an hour of being nobody. The point had made itself, and she was not going to get on a stage and turn it into curriculum. That was not how she operated. What she had done at the bar was not a performance. It was just who she was, expressed in 4 minutes, in a way that happened to be visible to other people. She understood why it resonated. She had spent 23 years in rooms where she was the thing that wasn't supposed to be there, and she understood exactly how tired people got of that story, never having a clean moment, never having a night at a bar where it resolved into something plain and final and quietly triumphant. People were hungry for those moments. She didn't blame them. She just wasn't going to perform the moment again on their behalf. The moment was done. It had happened. It had its own life now in the form of a story passing between strangers, and that was fine. The story could do whatever it needed to do. She had a fleet to run. Dal Pruitt, meanwhile, was having a week that was equal parts awful and instructive. He had not known about the post until Saturday. Gary had called him, which was the call you receive from a friend who has been watching a fire spread toward your house since Friday and has decided you need to know. And his first reaction, reading it on his phone in his kitchen, was the hot-faced particular shame of a man recognizing himself in a description he cannot argue with. He did not argue with it. His second reaction, which surprised him, was something smaller and stranger, a kind of relief. Not at the attention, not at any part of the public nature of the thing, but at the clarity. He had been carrying, for 6 years, a low-grade, unexamined static. The feeling that something about how he moved through the world wasn't quite right, but no clear picture of what, and no moment clear enough to look at directly. Thursday night had given him a picture. Clear, lit, impossible to misread. He called the therapist he'd seen twice and then stopped seeing. She had a cancellation on Wednesday. He took it. He did not post anything. He did not make any public statement. He did not contact the people running the story or respond to the comments, some of which were about him with a completeness and confidence that would have been easier to dismiss if they had been less accurate. He went to his Wednesday appointment. He came back the Thursday after that. He was, at 41, beginning to build something he had not known he needed to build, which was an understanding of himself that was not mediated by the structures that had previously done all the mediating for him. It was slow work. It was uncomfortable in the specific way that real work is uncomfortable. Not dramatic, not acute, just the steady low burn of paying attention to things you've been very successfully not paying attention to for a long time. He still went to the anchor's rest sometimes. He sat in his usual spot. He was careful in a new and deliberate way about the space around him, about who was standing where and what they might need, and whether his path through the room needed to account for other people's presence in it. It did. Of course it did. It always had. He was just learning to see it. The two of them, the rear admiral and the construction supervisor, the woman who commanded the Navy, and the man who'd shoved her without knowing, never spoke again after that Thursday. The story of what happened between them had traveled to more places than either of them would ever visit, and would be read by people in languages neither of them spoke, and would show up, years later, in conversations neither of them would ever be in. And they themselves had returned to their separate, parallel, ordinary lives. Except ordinary was not quite the right word. Not anymore. Something had shifted, in him, visibly, measurably. In the space between people at a bar, less visibly, but no less real. Margaret Calloway went back to running her fleet. The fleet kept moving. The ocean, which did not care about any of this, kept doing what oceans do. But somewhere in the particular invisible accounting of how people change, the slow, barely traceable record of moments that reorient something, Thursday night at the anchor's rest was in the ledger, for both of them. For rather more people than either of them would ever know. The thing about stories is that they keep moving after the people in them have stopped. Margaret Calloway was not on social media. She had never seen the point, in the specific practical way, that people who are required to choose between the appearance of doing things and the actual doing of them see that the appearance takes time away from the actual. She ran a fleet. She attended briefings that covered situations she could not discuss with anyone outside a secured room. She made decisions that would not appear in any public record and would never be explained to anyone who hadn't already been cleared to know. She had plenty of real life. She did not need the performance of life that social media required. So the wave that was building through November, the story of a Navy rear admiral and a drunk Marine in a bar, built without her watching it. Her aide kept her minimally informed, the numbers, the major outlets, the categories of response, and she listened with the same calibrated attention she gave to weather reports, noted, filed, not her immediate operational concern. What she did not know, could not have anticipated from inside her deliberate distance, was the specific shape the story was taking in certain corners of the conversation. Not the broad, popular version, the inspiring story of a powerful woman holding her ground, the satisfying geometry of authority being unknowingly challenged and then revealed, but the smaller, more specific conversations happening in military communities, in veterans forums, in the comment sections of posts on pages dedicated to military transition, where the responses were not about Margaret at all, but about Dale, about what he represented, about what he was being asked to reckon with. There was a veteran named Marcus who ran a small podcast out of his apartment in Jacksonville, Florida. He had done 12 years in the Navy himself, had gotten out at 32, had spent the subsequent 5 years struggling with the transition in ways that looked functional from the outside and were not from the inside. He had started the podcast because talking about the adjustment, the disorientation of going from a total institution that provided all structure and identity and purpose to a civilian world that provided none of those things and expected you to construct them from scratch, was the thing that had most helped him, and he wanted to create a space where other veterans could talk about it without it being a crisis narrative, without it being about trauma in the dramatic television sense, but about the ordinary, daily, invisible work of becoming a civilian person. He had, when the story broke, about 4,000 listeners. He recorded an episode about the Anchor's Rest incident the weekend after it went wide. He spent 40 minutes on it, talking carefully and personally about what he recognized in Dale's behavior, not defending it, not excusing it, but naming the mechanism. Talking about how the Marine Corps, like all the armed services, trains people in a way that is total and that is supposed to be total because the work requires total commitment. How it shapes not just skills, but the entire framework through which a person perceives the world. Who has authority? What physical space means? What counts as a challenge and what the appropriate response to a challenge is? What women in uniform mean versus what women not in uniform mean? How space is claimed and held? How this framework works for its purpose? How it becomes, when that purpose is removed, a kind of invisible distortion that the person wearing it often cannot see because it is the lens through which they see everything. He talked about his own version of it, not a bar shove, his own specific embarrassing moments of not seeing people correctly, of operating on automatic assumptions that the structure had built into him, of being shown, sometimes gently, sometimes not, that the automatic was not the right response in this terrain. He talked about what it took to see it, how it was not a single moment usually, but a series of them, how the series had to add up before you could build anything from them, how the process was not about shame. Shame was useful only in very small amounts, enough to register the impact, not enough to collapse into, but about the slow, patient work of updating the framework. The episode got shared, widely and specifically, in the communities where it mattered most. By the end of the week, it had been heard by more people than he'd reached in the previous 2 years combined. Marcus read the comments carefully. He was careful with comments, had learned to be, knew they could be radically instructive or radically corrosive depending on where you pointed your attention. He pointed it at the veterans talking to each other, the ones who were using his episode as an opening into conversations they hadn't known how to start. They were writing about their own versions of what he'd described, their own invisible frameworks, their own moments of realization, their own clumsy arrivals at the understanding that the person they'd become inside the institution was not automatically the right person for the life they were trying to live outside it. Some of them were funny about it, in the specifically dry, self-deprecating way that veterans are often funny about hard things, which is not minimizing, but a cultural technology, a way of holding something difficult at the right distance to look at it without being consumed by it. Some of them were not funny about it. Some of them were just honest in the stripped-down way that people are sometimes honest in online spaces, in the relative safety of anonymity, about things they couldn't say to their families or their partners or the colleagues who knew them by their public selves. One of them wrote, "I shoved someone too. Different situation, different place. Same thing underneath it. I never said anything to her. I don't know how to say anything to her. I don't even know if she'd want me to. But I needed someone to say it was possible to be different, and I think this story said it. So thank you for the episode." Marcus read that one several times. Then he reached out to a veteran peer support organization he'd been talking to about partnerships and said he wanted to do something more structured. He wanted to create something specifically for the civilian transition piece, not the PTSD crisis support, which existed and was vital, but the other thing, the below-the-crisis line thing, the daily disorientation and the framework mismatches, and the ways that people who had served were having their relationships and their communities and their sense of themselves slowly eroded by invisible mechanisms they couldn't name. The organization's director said yes, said they'd been wanting this for 2 years and hadn't known where to start. Marcus said he thought he knew where to start. This is one of the ways things grow from other things, not in the linear cause and effect sense that stories are sometimes told in, where event A leads directly to outcome B, clean and inevitable, but in the actual way things grow, which is sideways and simultaneous and not visible until you look back and trace the threads. The incident at the Anchor's Rest did not create Marcus's podcast. It did not create the need for veteran transition support. It did not single-handedly change the culture around what the military does and doesn't prepare people for. Those things were all already in motion, already being worked on by people who had been working on them long before Thursday night in November. What the story did was move at velocity through the exact communities where those things were being worked on, and give them a visible center, a concrete, unabstract, immediately comprehensible moment, around which a certain conversation could suddenly happen with more urgency and more shared reference than it had before. A story is a technology. Margaret, who had studied the history of naval communications, understood this in her bones, the way that a single signal at the right frequency can reach things that 100 other signals couldn't get to. She didn't think in these terms about what had happened in the bar. She'd gone there for a bourbon, not to send a signal, but the mechanics were the same regardless of intention. She was in her office the following Wednesday when her aide brought in a letter. Paper, formal, hand-addressed. The return address was Virginia Beach. She opened it. It was from Dale. It was short. A single page, handwritten, slightly uneven in the way that people's handwriting gets when they are writing something they have not been able to write for a while. He said he didn't expect a response. He said he was not writing to put anything on her, to ask for anything, to make himself feel better at her expense. He said he was writing because he had been raised to believe that when you wronged someone, you should say so directly, and not hide behind the version of yourself that had made the mistake. He said he was in therapy. He said that was not her problem or her responsibility, but he thought she might want to know. He said he was sorry for what he'd done, not the public version of sorry, not the kind performed for an audience, but the private kind, addressed to the person he'd put his hands on without her permission. He said he was trying to understand why he'd done it. He said he was starting to. He said he hoped her work was going well. He said he could tell, from what he'd read about her since, that she was good at it, and that the sailors under her command were lucky. And he meant that without irony or resentment. He meant it as a plain recognition of something real. He signed it Dale Pruitt, Staff Sergeant, USMC, Ret. Margaret read it twice. She looked out the window for a while, then she wrote back. Also by hand, also one page. She thanked him for the letter and for its directness, and said she received it in the spirit it was sent. She said she was glad he was in therapy, not because she thought he was broken, but because everyone who was paying attention to their own life found use for it eventually. She said she had spent her career in institutions that were very good at making people capable and very inconsistent at helping them understand the difference between capability and character, and that the gap between those two things was where most of the difficulty lived, for men and women both, inside the military and out. She said she hoped the work continued to go well. She did not sign it, Rear Admiral. She signed it, Margaret. She gave the letter to her aide-to-mail and went back to her briefing schedule. Neither of them would speak again after that. But the exchange, 2 letters, 2 pages, across the geography of Virginia, had completed something. Not a resolution, exactly. Not a conclusion, more like a closed circuit. 2 things that needed to be said had been said, correctly, between the 2 people they needed to be said between, without audience or performance, or the distorting lens of the public story that had attached itself to the private event. What the public story was doing, meanwhile, was doing what public stories do when they carry real weight. It was becoming a reference point, a thing people gestured at when they needed to illustrate something they were trying to say. The story appeared in training materials for military transition programs. It appeared in at least 2 academic papers about gender and authority in institutional settings, cited with the precise antiseptic language of academic citation that manages to simultaneously illuminate and entirely drain the life from whatever it touches. It appeared in a speech given by a senior Pentagon official at a leadership conference, used as an anecdote about presence under pressure, though the speaker got one detail wrong, and Margaret, reading a transcript later, made a small note of it and then decided it didn't matter. It appeared, most unexpectedly, in a women's studies class at a small college in Ohio. The professor had incorporated it into a unit on authority and embodiment, on the way that power reads differently depending on the body it lives in, on what it takes for authority to be legible when the body carrying it doesn't match the template. The students discussed it for a full class period. A few of them wrote about it in their response papers in ways that were careful and specific and showed real thinking. One of those students was from Morrow County. She went home for Thanksgiving that year and told her family about the class, about the story they'd read, about the Rear Admiral from Ohio who had gone to the Naval Academy at 18 and commanded a fleet at 44, and spent a Thursday night at a bar not backing down from a man who'd put his hands on her. Her grandmother, who was at the table, went very quiet in a particular way that the student recognized as the way her grandmother went quiet when something mattered. "Did you say she was from Ohio?" the grandmother said. "Yes, Grandma. Morrow County." The grandmother was quiet for another moment. "There was a girl in my church," she said slowly, "years ago. Very serious girl. Used to come to services with her family and then sit through the coffee hour with this look on her face like she was somewhere else entirely. Running miles every morning," her mother said. "Writing letters to the government about a naval career." She paused. "Her name was Margaret." The student looked at her grandmother. "That could be anyone, Grandma." "No," her grandmother said. "This kind of girl you remember. This is the part of a story that is almost too neat to be believed, too much like the ending of something carefully constructed, but it happened. The grandmother's church, the serious girl at coffee hour, the letters to the government. It happened because Ohio is not so large that things don't connect across 30 years, and because the kinds of people who write letters to the government about naval careers at 15 tend to be memorable, tend to leave an impression in places that outlasts the leaving. The student wrote about it in her journal that night, in her childhood bedroom that still had one corner of the ceiling that had been water-stained since she was 9 and that her parents kept meaning to fix. She wrote about it because it made the story feel different, less like something that happened to a symbol and more like something that happened to a person. A specific person who had been in specific rooms in a specific town, who had run specific miles in specific cold, who had been told by specific people in specific ways that she did not belong in the place she was heading, and who had gone there anyway and built something that turned out to be larger than anyone who'd tried to stop her had been capable of imagining. The student thought about this for a while. About the grandmother who remembered. About the girl at coffee hour going somewhere else in her head. About the 30 years between that girl and the woman at the bar who didn't move when a man put his hands on her. She thought about what it takes to be the version of yourself that is not the version other people can see yet. She thought about what it takes to build towards something for decades, in the absence of examples, in the absence of templates, in rooms that were not built for you, and to build it anyway with the full knowledge that each floor would be harder than the last and that no one was going to give you the blueprint. She was 20 years old. She was studying something she was not sure, yet led anywhere she was trying to go. She was in that particular young person state of feeling. The gap between who she was and who she might become is a physical ache, a constant low-level pressure, like weather living in her chest. She thought about the girl running miles in Ohio cold before the rest of the world woke up. She thought, okay then. The next morning she got up early. It was still dark outside, the November kind of dark that comes down like a lid. She put on her running shoes. She went outside into the cold. She had not been running. She had not been doing the particular daily, unglamorous maintenance that the distance between where you are and where you're going requires. But she had read about a woman who had, and something about the specificity of it. Not the general inspirational message, but the concrete physical reality of it. The cold morning, the neighbor's dog, the choice to keep moving when there was no one watching, had reached something she hadn't known needed reaching. She ran 2 miles. She was not fast, it was not pretty. The Morrow County cold was exactly as cold as it always was, which is to say completely uninterested in whether you were having a meaningful personal moment. She ran the 2 miles anyway. She went home. She had breakfast with her family. She drove back to campus Sunday afternoon and started working on the things she'd been putting off starting, the things she kept finding reasons to delay, because the reasons were always real and always insufficient. She started working on it. Margaret Calloway, who was in her office at Naval Station Norfolk running a fleet and attending briefings and making decisions that would not appear in any public record, did not know about the girl in Ohio, or the 2 miles, or the thing being started in a dorm room after Thanksgiving. She would never know about it. That is how most of the effects of a life work. Invisible, indirect, moving through chains of connection that the person at the origin point never traces and never sees. The stone drops and the rings move outward and outward and outward through water the stone never touches. She ran her fleet. The rings moved outward. The ocean kept doing what oceans do, indifferent, continuous, vast, and carrying everything. An inebriated Marine shoved her at the pub, unaware she commands the Navy.